Happy Thursday. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'm Christy Norris, Director of Carolina K-12 at UNC Chapel Hill. My most excellent colleague, Paul Benici, is, as always, with us behind the scenes. If you need any technical assistance as we get going, you can send him a little SOS in the chat if need be. And we are thrilled to spend this next hour here with you tonight, learning about the strong, the tenacious, the courageous LMA. A quick note about your hosts and sponsors tonight. Carolina K-12 is a program of Carolina Public Humanities at UNC Chapel Hill, and we are adamant that teachers need and deserve time to think as scholars and reflect as professional practitioners. And so we are dedicated to supporting teachers with free, high-quality professional development and curriculum. Please check us out at carolinak12.org. You can learn about our programs we have coming up. You can visit our database of hundreds of resources and lesson plans. And in addition to being able to receive CEUs tonight, we now also offer virtual modules on our website. You can go and complete those on your own time for CEUs, so check those out as well. And a huge thank you to our partners and sponsors for tonight's event, the incredible North Caroliniana Society. The Society is dedicated to the promotion, increased knowledge, and appreciation of North Carolina's history and heritage. And like us at Carolina K-12, they understand the importance of teachers as professionals and lifelong learners and scholars themselves having the time and space and access to high quality continuing education. And even beyond sponsoring great programming, they also love to treat teachers. So tonight they are providing 5 pieces of beautiful original art by Katie Hayes, who's going to be joining us tonight and offering a few songs. And via random drawing, 5 of the K-12 teachers in the audience with us this evening will receive a beautiful piece called Life of the Mind that Katie created actually in honor of teachers. So again, deep, deep gratitude to the North Caroliniana Society for everything they do for K-12 teachers all around the state. So throughout the program tonight, feel free to use the Q&A feature there on the edge of your screen to pose questions. Even though they aren't viewable publicly among all the participants, those do come to us. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. Many of you have already posed some excellent questions in your registration, so we really hope to frame this program around what you have said that you would like to learn. At the end of the event, we'll often try to go through and answer questions in writing that we didn't get to answer as part of the program, so stick around for that. And we'll, as always, follow up with each of you via email in the next few days with a lesson plan to teach about LMA in your classroom, a list of resources, additional readings, and things that you can look at to learn more about her. And also, this program will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can access the recording and share it with all your friends and make sure everybody knows about LMA. And so with that, on to tonight's Shiro. LMA, also known as her married name, May-Wiggins. You know, many of you noted in your questions and comments in your pre-registration that you went to North Carolina schools and yet never learned about this incredible story. And writer Joe Adkins thinks that that's not totally an accident. As he stated, martyred labor heroes like Wiggins are the great disappeared in most US history books because they all too clearly demonstrate the dark underside of class in the American story. Many would rather that part of the story never be told. At just 26 years old, LMA was a single working mother of 5 children under the age of 8. By 1929, she was working as a spinner on the graveyard shift for American Mill No. 2 in Bessemer City, where she worked 6 nights a week, over 60 hours per week, earning just $9 per week. 6 nights a week, she put her little children to bed and went to work. Worked all night and in the morning, returned home, surely exhausted beyond belief, made breakfast, if they were lucky enough to have made her meager wages last, and she took care of her kids until nightfall when she would put them to bed and do it all over again. But while the mill controlled her schedule, Ella insisted on maintaining some control of her own life too. She was known as headstrong and intelligent, and rather than rent one of the mill-owned homes right there beside her work, she chose to refute the social norms of Jim Crow and live in the African American neighborhood outside of town called Stumptown, where she felt she could have more independence away from mill ownership. And eventually, her desire for a better life for her children led her to join the National Textile Workers Union, who were organizing at the nearby Loray Mill in Gastonia. And we'll be learning about Ella, her life, and unfortunately her death this evening. But before I introduce Dr. David Zonderman, I want you to hear just a little bit about Ella May from two of her daughters. I'm going to share just a 2-minute quick clip from a 1984 interview with Millie and Charlotte Wiggins. And this interview is from our friends at UNC's Wilson's Library Southern Historical Collection. And it'll really help to set the stage for us to learn about the incredible Ella May.
We were all, like our heads were all skint, you know, because we'd had sores from not getting the proper food.
Yeah,
We were pretty dirty, I guess, ragged, you know.
Well, Myrtle was 10 years old, 10-year-old kid cooking and taking care of 4 other children. That's ridiculous.
Well, I think Clyde and I, we took care of ourselves.
I'll just take, for instance, like they had made like $500,000 profit after laying off so many people and doubling the work on the ones that they had there. And he said, well, we made $500,000 by laying that many off and making the other ones work harder. Let's lay some more off and put the work, that much more work, onto the ones that are there. We should make more money. Well, that is why the union got started in North Carolina. Our mother couldn't take anymore. They were working 12 hours a day. They were sick. Their kids were sick. They weren't making any money. $7 a week. Working 12 hours a day.
Starvation wages.
Well, that's their communists. They'll go where the people aren't satisfied and they aren't making a living, and that's how your communists get started.
Vera's husband was the one, he was the head of that. Vera and her husband was the head of the union organization that went down south. In fact, they went all Philadelphia, the steel mills, and that's what her husband was noted for. When she went down south there, her husband took her down there, and he went and left her down there doing the organization, or whatever you call it.
Organizing.
And she said that, she told me that when she seen those people up there at Bessemer Mills at Mama, she was the most outstanding, said she could just look at her and tell Mama was intelligent. Said she seemed to be smarter than the rest of us.
So we're going to start here. I've asked if you could just take a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes here to give us a little bit of a mini lecture, kind of a whirlwind overview of some facts and some history here. And then we'll spend the rest of our time in conversation, answering the questions that our audience poses. And in a bit, we'll even hear a little bit of music. But for now, I'm going to disappear and give you the stage as you kind of set the stage for us in terms of Ella May and the Loray Mill strike.
Okay, well, what I want to do is I'll do 3 things to get us started. I'll talk a little bit about the Loray Mill, where the strike took place in Gastonia. And then I'll talk a little bit about the strike, and then I'll talk a little bit about Ella May. I'll pick up on some of the things that Christy already mentioned. She herself is a superb teacher and historian, so it's great to always work with a terrific colleague. So just so folks know, the Loray Mill was built right at the turn of the 20th century. It had what's called absentee owners. In other words, the people that owned the plant and put up much of the money were mainly in the New York area. And that's a bit unusual for North Carolina textiles. Most, certainly not all, but most North Carolina textile mills, at least when they were built in the late 19th and early 20th century, tended to be built by local people who then owned them. But the Loray Mill was a bit unusual that way. It was also quite large. Most textile mills in North Carolina are smaller. Now, again, if you come from around Roanoke Rapids, say, or down around Kannapolis, you're going to say, well, what about the big mills there? And you're right, there are these big mills. But again, they're unusual. So Loray Mill, you might say, is not your typical North Carolina mill, but it was a really important one, particularly because of the strike we'll talk about in a moment. At its height, it employed about 3,500 people. Right around Loray Mill, you could say, was what is often called a company town. The company owned the mill housing. It owned the stores that the mill workers mainly shopped at. It built the churches where they prayed at and hired the ministers. And in fact, there's a great new book that came out recently about religion in the South and the working class and how many workers went to company churches. They also had a private police force that cooperated with the local police and the county sheriff. World War I was a good time for textiles. Not surprisingly, a lot of uniforms made, and that produced a great demand for textiles. But right after the war, the industry took a slump. And even though much of the 20s is seen as a period of prosperity in the United States, there are lots of exceptions to that. In fact, when I teach my students about the 20s, I'm always cautioning them not to just get hung up on flappers and bathtub gin and all that. There were what were called chronically sick industries. Agriculture was one, mining was another, and a third one was textiles. The textile industry never recovered from the slump after the war. All through the 20s, while many other industries were booming, such as auto manufacturing and radios and things like that, textiles never really recovered. So as you heard in the oral history of Ella May's children, they cut jobs at the plant. You can see from about 3,500 down to 2,200. And of the people remaining, they did make them work harder. You had what was called both the stretch out and the speed up. And the stretch out means if you were tending 5 looms, you are now told you're tending 10. And the speed up means exactly what it means. If the loom was running at a particular speed, it would now run faster. At the same time, workers, some of them took pay cuts as high as 50%. In 1929, there was the strike, and we'll talk more about that in 1 minute. And just so you know, in 1933, the mill goes bankrupt and the Firestone Tire Company buys it to produce tire cord. Some of you may be old enough to remember when if you cut into a tire, you could see these almost like mini bits of rope in tires to bind them together. So that was a product that Firestone needed a lot of, and this mill made it. And 60 years later, in 1993, the mill shut down permanently. It was vacant for a while. It has now been rehabbed into apartments, shops. They actually have a very nice little museum there. I've seen it. And it does talk about the strike. It doesn't hide it. Though I'll also mention one of the things I recently served on the State Highway Historic Marker Committee. And for many years, there was a historic marker about the strike that the people in Gastonia never wanted to put up. So it sat around for literally years until they finally put it up outside the mill. And it's a very plain marker. It doesn't say a lot, but it was a big battle to even get that up there. Okay, the strike takes place in 1929. It begins on April 1st. The end date, I got to tell you, is a little fuzzy. Kind of like the union kind of said one day, we're done, we're kind of picking up and moving out of town, so the strike's over. And our best estimate is late September, shortly after Ella May is murdered. So it goes on for more than 6 months, almost 6 full months. The organization driving it is the National Textile Workers Union. It is true that the leadership at that time in 1929 did have strong affiliation with the Communist Party. The leader of the strike was a man named Fred Beal. There was also, you heard the name Vera Weisbard, a number of other leaders, both from the South, but also from outside the South. The local community mostly is not part of the Communist Party, though they get tarred and feathered with that accusation. Most of the local folks that are joining the strike are all about fighting the bad working conditions and the low pay. And in fact, most of them don't have much interest in communist politics, or for that matter, racial justice. That's an interesting side note, that the leadership of the strike was very interested in organizing black and white workers together. But if you know anything about your history of North Carolina and Gastonia in 1929, among local people, that didn't work out very well. So you have this interesting situation of some community strike leaders that are very pro-labor and very strongly supporting the strike, but they're not what we would call today, quote unquote, liberal. When it comes particularly to racial issues, they're extremely conservative. So if you look at the demands of the strike, it's a 40-hour work week, which in the 1930s would finally be legalized, a $20 a week minimum wage, equal pay for men and women. That's an interesting demand ahead of its times, recognition of the union, and as one worker said, to hell with the Hank clock. The Hank clock was a mechanism on every loom or every spinner it was basically early worker monitoring. You could tell how fast the machine was running and how much was being produced, and workers would be graded on how much they produced every day and every week, and judged on that. So many of them wanted to get rid of that monitoring device. Shortly after the strike that begins, Governor Gardner, who is himself a mill owner, calls out the National Guard. There's a series of violent clashes around the mills. Some workers try to go back and other workers try to prevent them. Within a week or two, many striking workers are thrown out of their houses and wind up in tent colonies. At one of the larger tent colonies, one evening in June, a group of police show up. Shots are fired. It's one of these cases. It's at nighttime. It's very confusing. Nobody knows to this day who fired the first shot. The chief of police, a man by the name of Adderholt, is killed. Just a little side note, a few years ago, I was on public radio, and we were talking about this strike, and it was a call-in program, and a woman from Florida called and said she was Police Chief Adderholt's great-granddaughter. And we had a really fascinating discussion. And she told us about, she'd never met her great-grandfather, obviously, but heard stories from her parents and grandparents about the strike and what happened. The strike leaders are put on trial for murder. I won't, since we're doing a very short introduction, there's a long series of trials, mistrials, retrials, convictions. After the first mistrial, a group of vigilantes round up certain strike leaders and beat them severely. They in turn are arrested, but they are never convicted. After Ella May-Wiggins is murdered, the people who are accused of murdering her are also put on trial. They are not convicted. So that's a whole nother complex story that goes with the strike. Many of the strikers were blacklisted. That is, they were not let back to work, and their names were sent to many surrounding mills who would not hire them. Within the town of Gastonia and within the county-wide, the message was sort of given to tell people to forget the strike. That's one of the reasons why even decades later, it was so hard to get a highway marker put up, because many people sort of said, well, we don't want to know about it. And why you bring it up? We heard it was a terrible thing. There are many historians, and I would agree with these historians who argue that Gastonia is not the only strike, but it's one of many that in the end do not go good for workers. And it feeds into this memory among workers that unions are, bad, don't get involved with them. And that is why to this day, some of you may or may not know that North Carolina is known as a very challenging place to organize unions. We have one of the lowest, we in South Carolina have the lowest unionization rates in the country. Our rate now is between 3% and 4%. As a historian, I would argue this is an example of how history sort of weighs on people, and the stories, and in some cases, the myths that spring up shape people's perceptions. I think if you look back at this strike, it was quite justified, and the workers' struggles were quite brave. But that's not the memory. The memory was the communists came in and stirred up trouble, and unions are communists, and they're all a bunch of outsiders, and you don't want to mess with them. So if someone says the word union, you tell them to shut their face, and you go on. And again, that's a memory that lasts literally for generations. I still meet people who say, I sometimes give talks like this in public libraries and places like that, and people sometimes come up and say, well, that was really interesting. My grandmother told me unions are the devil's work, and I should never talk about unions and never talk to a union person. And so, and again, my job as a historian is try to get people to understand, why do you think your grandma said, unions are the devil's work? So let's turn now and talk a little bit about Ella May-Wiggins. And again, Christy mentioned a few things, and I just want to reemphasize them. She was not working in Gastonia. She was not at the Loray Mill. She was at a nearby mill in another town called Bessemer City. In 1929, she was either 27 or 28. A lot of people back then didn't have birth certificates. There's some debate whether she had 7 or 9 children. At the time she died, she had 5 living children. Several children had died from whooping cough, and her husband had abandoned the family. As Christy mentioned, Ella May was known as a bit of a rebel. She was outspoken. She didn't always abide by the sort of customs of the county, you might say. She lived openly with a partner, a man she was not married to, named Charlie Shope. And in fact, after Ella May was murdered, Charlie Shope later did marry a woman, had a couple children. So there's also some half sisters to Ella May's children, and apparently the families now know each other and talk with each other. She did live in Stumptown, which was a mainly Black neighborhood, and that was considered shocking at the time. Nobody knows exactly why. One possibility is the rent was cheaper and she was making very little money and had to feed a bunch of children. Another theory was it was a number of white mill workers would have Black women watch their children while they worked. So it was closer by to Black women that could watch her children. Another theory was she was just a rebel and she was just saying, I'm not hung up on Black and white people. These people in this neighborhood are nice to me. I'm going to live there. She does get very involved in the union and in the local strike. She becomes the bookkeeper for the union local, even though she doesn't have a lot of training or formal education, but apparently she was good with figures. And she manages the strike fund and the aid that comes in. She also apparently had a beautiful singing voice and was known as a songwriter. Her most famous song is Mill Mother's Lament, and we'll hear that in a minute. And she's murdered right near the end of the strike on September 14th, 1929. What was supposed to happen was a big rally was planned that day. But then there was word that a bunch of vigilantes were going to come and attack the strike rally. So the union called off the rally. But apparently word didn't get to Ella May and some others that were coming from Bessemer City. And as they got to the outskirts of Gastonia, they were stopped by a mob and told to turn around the truck they were in. They turned around, but then another car blocked them. Another car came up from behind and rammed the truck. And people came out and started opening fire. And a number of people were wounded. Ella May was hit by a bullet in the spine and died shortly thereafter. And she became certainly what was often called a martyr to the cause. So that's a very quick view of the mill and the strike and the very short but very powerful life of Ella May-Wiggins.
I'd like to kind of dive into a little bit with you is just what conditions for folks were like at this time, a little bit more about the conditions they were working under, because people were literally at this time working themselves to death. You heard in that interview, he called it starvation wages. And that's one of the things that really gets me about this story. You have this single mother. She's lost 4 children. 4 of her young children have died, but she's raising 5 children, all I think, under the ages of 8 years old, and working all night, every night, as hard as she possibly can, and not getting by. They were in deep, deep poverty. But this is a strong woman who womans through and still gets up every day and goes to work and does it. That I think that's supposed to be the concept of the American dream, right? But this in no way sounds like a dream. So can you just give us a little bit more of a sense of the conditions, and also, was this the exception or was this the norm?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Conditions, I mean, working in textile mills was always a kind of lower end job in terms of textiles, both in the North and in the South. Wages tend to be lower than in other manufacturing, say at this time, auto or steel or something like that. Textile workers were going to definitely make lower wages. Textiles was always a low margin business. So companies were always trying to find ways to cut costs, run faster, either lay off people or squeeze work out of the people you had. They were also always harder to organize because, again, they often tended to be smaller mills. Again, Loray's an exception. It's a bigger mill. Whereas, for example, a steel mill often had 5,000 or 10,000, mostly men working in it. So conditions were always difficult. In the 20s, they got worse. And again, that's something to really understand. We have this impression of the 20s being prosperous, the roaring 20s. And on if our teachers sort of, I know none of them teach C&E. So if you look at the macroeconomics, like national income, it was going up. The middle class was growing. So I always want to remind my students, I'm not saying that the economy as a whole wasn't doing well in the 20s. I'm saying within that overall economy, you had particular industries that were not doing well, and textiles is one. So you take an industry that's already tough and it's getting tougher. It's getting worse. And this is going on all over the country, not only in the South, but in the North as well. There are a series of strikes both before the war and after World War I in various textile mills, both South and North. And it's one of the reasons why Gastonia is so well known, because again, the 20s is seen as a time when when there's a lot of anti-unionism, and the idea is workers don't need unions, everyone's doing fine. It's the roaring 20s. And along comes Gastonia to kind of put a finger in the eye and say, wait a minute, it's not as good as you think it is. We here in North Carolina are really suffering. And as far as Ella May, I would say she's both typical and not typical at the same time. I mean, the fact that she had a number of young children, that she herself was working in the mill, that's true of a number of mill families because, again, the wages were so low that very often both the father and the mother would work, and often children as young as 8 or 10 or 12 would also work in the mill. Now, in her case, of course, her husband had abandoned the family, and that also was all too common. In fact, I was recently talking with my labor history students in the class I'm teaching this semester. We're happening to look at the 19th century, but one of the things that we now know from looking at things like census records is that divorce wasn't very common in the 19th century, but abandonment was, or you almost might call it semi-abandonment, where the husband is just not around much, or he goes missing for a while and comes back and sort of in and out. So that, again, is not unusual, but it would have made Ella May's situation even more difficult. But the fact that she lived openly with another man, the fact as a white woman, she lived in a black neighborhood, the fact that she got so involved in this strike to the point where she was the bookkeeper for the union, that makes her pretty exceptional. So her day-to-day life would not have been unusual, but what she did about it, she seems to have been as I say, a bit of a rebel, a woman that was like, I'm not going to tell you, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to tell me what I'm going to do. And that's pretty unusual for a time.
That's why we love her. Yes. So a little bit, let's go to the strike and talk a little bit about the National Textiles Workers Union, which you mentioned. It's run by the Communist Party. Oh my God, communists in the South. That's a dangerous, terrifying thing, right? But they're, seeking to organize in the South. But from what it sounds like, from what you said, would you say they made a difference, or did they just come down and make a big mess in Loray? Ultimately, this strike, I think you said, is kind of classified as a failure overall. But did it have any benefit, or did they literally just come and make a big kerfuffle and then carry on?
Um, no, but I guess I would say they made a difference, but they also attracted a heck of a lot of opposition. So I
Mm.
think we have to admit both. Um, I would say this the strike itself had an interesting combination of some very deep support in the community, some folks who literally lived in tents and pretty much out in the open for 6 months, and then kind of lost everything at the end. Took a lot of courage to do that. But at the same time, the leadership from the union itself that was sent, the kind of professional leadership, for lack of a better word, was mainly affiliated with the Communist Party, and they brought excellent leadership skills, and they themselves were dedicated. These people wound up in jail on trial for their lives, so they had real dedication to the cause as well. So I would argue this is a strike that has both, for lack of a better word, hometown support. It also has a kind of coordination that the union brings, but because the union is openly radical, they're not hiding it, that in turn brings sort of the forces of of the state literally on their heads.
Mm.
So in the end, if you ask me, was the presence of this union a plus or a minus? Well, being a good historian, of course, the answer is always both. It's never one or the other. It's, what's the answer in history? I always tell my students, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So it really is both. I mean, this, we'll never know how the strike would have happened without. And that's another thing I always recommend is don't do hypothetical history. History enough is hard enough to work through. But with the union there, they gave them a certain leadership. They brought in outside strike funds, thousands of dollars. So most people were fed even while they were living in tents. They did not starve, but they also produced probably even more. Look, the strike would have always met opposition. The mill was not going to say, oh, sure, you can have a union. We'll give you $20 a week. Yeah, great. That was never going to happen. They were always going to bust the strike. But having the communists there, of course, gave all the sort of local law enforcement a second pretext. Not only you strikers, you're commies, and you're dangerous because commies are godless and they're destroying America, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And remember also that the Communist Party didn't hide the fact it believed in racial equality, which was going to really set people off in the South, including some of the workers. We
Right.
have to admit that. Most of the workers were white. In fact, it was very unusual for black men and women to have jobs in the mills unless they were like janitorial. And many of those white workers were not interested in civil rights for black people. So, and they said that to the Communist Party leaders. They basically said, if you want to help us with our strike, that's fine. But if you're going to preach to us about getting white and black folk together, go sell it somewhere else. We are not listening. Now, there was a small group that started to sort of embrace that, but the majority were like, we just want to get a better wage and don't talk about all this black and white stuff. We're not interested, and all that's going to do is raise more hell, and we don't want that. So
We want our rights, but not rights for.
yeah, exactly. So, and we just have to admit that, again, we don't want to make people into angels. We
Yep.
don't want to make them into perfect heroes. They are people of their time. I am certainly not defending white racism. I'm certainly not defending it today, and I'm not defending it in 1929. But we don't want to be shocked by that, I think. For people who act like, oh, that's so shocking, wouldn't they want to organize with black people? I try to get them to understand, you got to go back almost 100 years into the South. And if you think they were going to organize white and black together, you're sort of in a dream world. You're not
Right.
really looking at the world of the time.
Right.
And again, it doesn't mean to say it's good. It's to say as historians, we got to understand the world we're looking at.
Right, right. It's funny, you said that word radical several times, and it's so interesting. And maybe it's just a matter of having historical perspective, but the things they were asking for, some of them a 40-hour work week, a 5-day work week, decent and sanitary working conditions. These were not, if you noticed, one of the images portrayed their list. Was that radical back then? Now, I do know, equal pay for equal work for women and youth, certainly radical. That's radical today, right? But it's just kind of crazy at any point that that would be considered radical, yet it absolutely was.
Yeah, and there's a case where the fact that the strike was linked to the union and the union was linked to the Communist Party meant that people could throw around the word radical just sort of whenever they wanted to. So yes, I agree with you. Most of their demands are not radical. They're certainly not radical today. And even then, I don't think we'd call them radical. We would call them, I don't know, significant, or yes, these people wanted, like a 40-hour week was not radical, quote unquote, in some kind of like change the nature of capitalism radical. But it did so, it was considering, as you were saying, the typical work week could be 60 hours a week or more. They were asking for a big cut. So again, it kind of, I guess we could play with the word radical. I don't see it as radical. I'm not sure even people at the time really would have thought it was radical, but they use that word because the minute it was radical, radical equals communist, and communist means we set our hair on fire and we go crazy, start running around and scare everybody. So it became a very effective target then.
Yeah, I appreciate Eugene has said in the chat box, radical then, but these are things we take for granted, many of us today, that, because of this fight, sometimes change happens and we take that for granted today. So Bob is asking about the role of law enforcement during the Loray Mill strike. Did the law work with and support the textile owners, the mill owners mostly? Were they there to break up the union? Or was there any sympathy among the local folks for the plight of these mill workers, kind of asking for a better life?
Again, excellent question. For the most part, law enforcement was used to break the strike and to protect the mills and support the mill owners. There's a little bit of evidence, and this happens in other strikes as well, where some of the local sheriff deputies tended to come from similar backgrounds. Being a sheriff deputy is kind of a working class type job. So many of the men that were deputies might have had friends that worked in the mills. So it's probably one of the reasons why the governor called out the National Guard, because the National Guard came from outside of Gastonia. It either came up from Charlotte or from Greensboro. I think a unit came from Raleigh, and their attitude was, we don't know any of these people. Our commander says, line up here and fix bayonets. That's what we're going to do. Again, many of the guard themselves were young guys. I'm sure they weren't super comfortable. I mean, I don't think they had any. And in fact, again, you showed one of the famous pictures of a young woman wrestling with a guard. She was trying to grab his gun. And they did that. I mean, these women were, they were called Amazons and Hellcats, and they weren't taking guff from anybody. But for the most part, and this is true throughout most of American labor history, police, militia, National Guard, federal troops, whenever law enforcement is called out in strikes, almost always they are there to break strikes. It is very rare that they protect strikes. There's a famous example. I mean, if you don't mind me going a little, me, I tend to just keep going. So very quickly, during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, all hell broke loose in Pittsburgh. And when they first called out the local militia, the people in the local militia said, we're not going to shoot our own friends. So then they called out a unit from Philadelphia. And just like today with the sports rivalries, people in Philadelphia are like, hey, you want me to shoot people from Pittsburgh? Fine. Where do I sign up? So local militias you had to be kind of careful with. Sometimes you had to bring in outside militia to sort of do the dirty work, you might say. But that's true in many other countries too. It's one of the reasons why over the 19th and 20th century, we've created professional police forces, because the idea is you want people that are trained to sort of listen from commands from above, not line up with their neighbors and say, well, we're all in this together. That was seen as very dangerous.
Right. So, we have had some folks ask different versions of the question of what made the union latch on to Ella May. And I think part of that perhaps has to do with not only her personality, but also her skills as a musician. So I would love to invite Katie Hayes on. David, I'm going to let you take a breather, get some water, and I'm going to ask Katie Hayes to join us because she's going to offer us a performance of one of Ella May's most famous ballads, The Mill Mother's Lament. And just a little bit about Katie, the rock star. She is a printmaker, an illustrator, a songwriter. She lives in Hillsborough, North Carolina. She specializes in place-based design and creates eco-friendly hand-pulled block prints as well as textile designs. When she's not in the studio, she enjoys playing Americana music with her husband in venues all around the Triangle. I encourage you to check out her beautiful artwork at New South Pattern House. And Katie is here to perform, as I said, Ella May's Mill Mother's Lament, a song that Ella wrote and performed as a means of calling attention to mill work and life. So, Katie.
Hi, everybody. I just want to say I had the hardest time learning this song, in part because the lyrics, as you'll hear, are so heartbreaking that my 3-year-old son kept bursting into tears every time I would try to play it at the house. We leave our homes in the morning, we kiss our children goodbye, while we slave for the bosses, our children scream and cry. And when we draw our money, our grocery bill to pay, not a cent to spend for clothing, not a cent to lay away. And on that very evening, our little son will say, I need some shoes, mother, and so does Sister May. How it grieves the heart of a mother, you everyone must know. But we can't buy for our children, our wages are too low. It is for our little children, it seems to us so dear. But for us northern dear workers, the bosses do not care. But understand all workers are union they do feel. Let's stand together and have a union here.
Yay. Thank you. That song, as a mother, I'm sure every mother listening, it really, really touches you. So, I'd love to hear from you. I know you and I were talking about this, and you said you went to school in Western North Carolina, never learned about Ella May. But what was it like for you when I asked you to kind of think about some songs? What was it that struck you about this particular song, The Mill Mother's Lament?
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in Cullowhee, North Carolina, and like a lot of us participating, had never really heard of Ella May-Wiggins, anything about this strike when I was sort of going through school, but also as a songwriter, as a person who grew up listening to folk music, old time bluegrass music in North Carolina, of which I was quite immersed in that. And I sort of feel like I have been robbed of this homespun songwriting heroine. In addition to her historical importance, she's just a brilliant songwriter.
Yeah.
And so a couple things stood out to me as I was going through her catalog of work and trying to choose which song I wanted to cover, is that she sings from the perspective of a woman, which I think is really powerful and also really unusual in folk music of this time.
Mm-hmm.
And she sings from the perspective, she's funny. She's smart, she's funny, she's powerful. She cleverly takes popular tunes to popular songs of the time and writes these sort of subversive lyrics. So that I just have this vision of the people who were at the union rally the night before sort of humming,
Waiting for a Train by Jimmy Rogers, but really it's all around the jailhouse, and they're humming, about how they the working conditions can't keep them down. They're going to go join the union anyway. So I was really inspired by, obviously, the picture that she paints through her songwriting is grim.
Yeah.
And hard, but also she's so bold about it, and she's so, she doesn't focus on that part. She focuses on, we're going to join a union and they're scared of us.
That's right.
So.
That's right. It's about, she is not a victim. She is a survivor all the way around. Yeah. Yeah. And I know you really went through it, speaking about how she is, not known as a balladeer. I know you really went through it trying to find music to figure out, you did a lot of patchworking, finding these lyrics and trying to find out which tune it would have been to. So for all the teachers watching, just so you know, we're going to give you some links of where to get to her songs. They make really great pieces of poetry, I think, to just study with your students. Really just a window into the soul, into the time. So, and I think listening to your voice, it was exactly as Ella May would have saying, you should know. There's several comments. Nadine has said she wants Katie to know her prints are as wonderful as her voice. So thank you so much. And if everybody wants to see that little print up, I don't know if that's your right or my right, but that is the print that 5 lucky teachers will be winning tonight, straight from Katie's studio, courtesy of the North Caroliniana Society. So Katie, thank you. I'm going to let you rest your voice. We're going to hear from you again at the very end of our event in just a little bit. And for now, I'm going to invite Dr. Zonderman back on, and we'll continue our talk. That's a tough act to follow, David. I mean,
well, and you don't want to hear me sing. So my dog will start howling with me.
Yeah. So, David, what do you think, just in terms of union movement, the movement in general, what have you seen in terms of the role of music? Anytime I think of protest and resistance, music is such a big piece of that. Can you speak to that in terms of the labor movement at all?
Sure. No, absolutely. And well, Katie said one thing that is spot on, and that is a number of union songwriters have often taken popular tunes and put new lyrics, because they know people already know the tunes. The most famous one is probably Joe Hill, the great songwriter in the early 20th century, who wrote what's called the IWW Little Red Songbook. And almost all the tunes were popular at that time. I mean, in the good old summertime became on the good old picket line and things like that. So, and certainly later on, people like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Odetta, Joan Baez, lots of people picked up on various protest traditions. The famous song "We Shall Overcome" was first sung at a union rally, and later then picked up by the modern civil rights movement. So yeah, music has been important. I would say in recent years, less so, and that's a struggle. I've been at some meetings where people have said we need, new union songwriters, and if we're going to reach a new generation, we have to sing their music. So maybe it will happen again, but certainly up to at least the 30s and 40s, music was important to the labor movement. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to take us to a not so happy point, which is about the shooting, Ellis shooting. And
Sure.
To lead into this, I'm going to first ask Paul just to cue up another quick clip for us from the Southern Historical Collections interview with Millie and Charlotte, Ella's daughters, where they talk about their mother's death. It's just around 4 minutes, and then I'm going to ask David to respond. We also have a question in the chat about whether or not her murderers, whoever shot her, if they ever stood trial, if there were ever any repercussions. So David, I'll let you sit on that.
Well, she was threatened at work when the strike started. They had asked the colored people, which had been doing, just a odd job around the mill, and the chief lady,
Dirty.
yeah, they had asked them to go to work and do the work for, like, run the equipment like Mom and them with the mill, and Mama had talked to them. She was real close to the colors, you know, more so than anybody else, because we lived right down there amongst them, and they knew Mama and they trusted Mama. All right, Mama told them, said, don't do it. Said, because if you do go to work for them and do that work, after the strike's over, you're going to be put back in the same position you were, and said you'll just be just as bad off as what you are. Said you got to fight for anything you want, and if you stand up and fight with us, said then you can, it'll be like joining with us, and said you'll be better off. And so, Mama, and when they would go have their meetings, they said that they'd run a line, a rope down the hall where they had it, and the blacks were on one side, and the whites were on the other. Said my mama just cross over that rope and go over amongst all the colors, and there was and she was the only one that could do it, you know, and get away with it. Colored people were going to go to work, you know, at first, but after Mama talked to them, they decided, well, we better hadn't. And so when they come to get the colored people to go to work, well, they said no. Said Miss Ella May's already talked to us about that and said we're not going. And one of the men, I don't know who he was, but I've heard Mama talk about it. She said that he threatened her, said, all right, Ella May, said you're getting yours. And I don't know if that guy's the one that shot my mama or not, but I know that Mama,
They said
he-
Tom
she
McIntyre, but
she had been threatened, is all I know.
Would you repeat that about your mother having a premonition, say she had a dream? That
she had a dream, and she had a trunk that she got all the stuff together that she had for each one of the children, and set it all aside, and she said, I will be shot through a window. And Uncle told her, he said, well, if you know that this is dangerous, drop it. You have children. Take care of your children. Let other people do the fighting. You just leave it alone, drop it. And she said, no. She says, I want my children to have something other than what I've got. She said, I don't want them to have to live like I did. So every time she'd go anywhere, when she went into a room or anything, she'd sit with her back to the wall, facing the window. And they asked her why this was, and she laughed and she said, well, I'm going to get shot through a window. And she says, they will shoot me to my face. They won't shoot me behind the back. And so the day that she went out, well, you said that Mom talking them all into not taking guns with them out on this rally that they had that day. Well, my father, Charles Choate, my cousin, Frank Picklesheimer, they were there. My mother was standing up in the back of the cab of the truck. Lincolnfeld was driving the truck. He said that his window was open, and the bullet, when it came in, I told my dad and uncle, I used to listen to them talk, and I said, well, Mom said she dreamed she got shot through a window. She didn't get shot through a window. She got shot off the back end of a truck. And Charles says, no, your mother got shot through the cab window. The bullet came through, and my mother was standing with the left side evidently towards the window. It came through the window and went through the left arm and then through the back to the heart. And when she fell in my dad's arm. He grabbed her, and she said, they shot me dead. And my father reached over to grab her so that she wouldn't fall off the truck. And as he leaned over, the next shot that came through went through his hand. And Frank Picklesheimer, before the truck even stopped, he was at the truck that they were on had been stopped. They had turned a car over in front of it. But before they could stop Frank, he jumped to the back of the old truck there and just went for the crowd. He was screaming. Charles said he was a screaming maniac. He said, you rotten yellow sons of bitches, you done killed Ellie Mae. And he said, which one of you did? Well, they started to disperse then. But some people think that they were just shooting into the truck, but my father and my uncle spent money to try to find out. And what I'd like to know to this day, who did kill May?
So several of you asked, we will share that entire interview with you and your follow-up resources. But David, I know you don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, but why do you think Ella was shot? Was this strategic? Was this murder? In that interview, her family goes on to say they believe it was state sanctioned, that this was the state. Charlotte literally says, you kill Ella, you kill the Union in North Carolina. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's I've heard two different theories, and like many murders that take place in a chaotic fashion, we don't ever really know. One was, it was just a kind of a mob clash, that a group of people heard that this crowd from Bessemer City were coming to the rally, even though the rally was canceled, and another group, an anti-union group, came out of Gastonia, and they met on the highway, and kind of all hell broke loose and shooting started. They may have known, someone may have recognized Ella May on the truck, so that some of them may have been gunning for her. The other theory was more deliberate, like they somehow knew she was on that truck. The goal was to actually stop the truck because she was on it, try to kill her. Now, who set them up? Again, the vigilante groups tended to be, often were local working folk, but they tended to be encouraged by local merchants, local mill owners, maybe the local sheriff. Don't forget the local police chief had been killed. So there was a lot of bad blood and a lot of vengeance. The idea that if you killed her, you would stop the Union, again, that's possible. She was certainly well known by then, and getting sort of reputation being a woman who sang and was outspoken. So she even went to Washington, D.C. with a group of strikers at one point. So she certainly was attracting both support and controversy. So did she literally have a target on her back? It's possible. I mean, again, I don't know if we'll ever know. There's been no little kind of smoking gun proven. Someone did ask, there was a trial. Several people were put on trial for the murder and for the shootings overall, and they were acquitted because people said, oh, we don't have any direct evidence. We don't know exactly who pulled the trigger. There were no convictions out of that murder or the shooting as a whole in that incident. So I know someone else asked in the chat what happened to their children. They wound up in a local Presbyterian orphanage. And I'm not positive. I believe the youngest child was the daughter of Charlie Shope, her partner. And I think maybe when he married, he took that child in, but I'm not positive about that. But the others were in an orphanage.
Yep. In that interview, Paul's put the full interview in the chat, talks a lot about that. They talk a lot about that experience. So we're coming up on time, but I do have a few other questions I want to pitch to you while we have you here. One is, which you have acknowledged, is that this is taking place in the kind of central to Jim Crow. This is right in the heart of Jim Crow, North Carolina. And could you talk a little bit about that? Anna is asking to hear about how Ella May specifically organized Black and white workers during this time. We heard in that excerpt, she literally crossed the color line. What role, what was happening in terms of organizing Black and white workers together in North Carolina specifically? As you said, that was, there are a lot of people who were like, that's not okay here.
Right.
What role did that play in this?
In regard to this strike, as I mentioned before, the vast majority of the workers would have been white. When the textile mills developed, they were sort of, for lack of a better word, sold to poorer white Southerners as come take these jobs. Your families will be saved from starvation on the farm. These are jobs for white people. Mm-hmm. And again, so that it was just a small number of blacks got jobs in textile mills until the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. Mm-hmm. So in terms of organizing workers for this strike, it's mainly organizing white workers. Mm-hmm. It is true, again, we'll go back to the point of Ella May seemed to be somebody that both lived in a Black neighborhood and seemed very comfortable, like seemed to almost be ahead of her time when it came to sort of cross-racial community organizing. She was willing to, as you said, literally cross lines, talk to Black men and women. How much she actually organized, I don't know. Again, the Communist Party wanted to do that, but they didn't get a lot of support, and in the South.
Right.
That was still seen as just a sort of a bridge too far for sort of two reasons. One was most white workers weren't willing to do it, and therefore, among local white leaders, the idea was then don't push it, because all you're going to do is you're going to cripple our organizing efforts. Again, we can look back and say, gee, if they had actually organized both Blacks and Whites together, it would have been a much more powerful movement.
The fusion movement.
You know, we can kind of say that if we were back in 1929 Gastonia, you know, we'd like to think we would have made that argument. Maybe we would have, maybe we wouldn't. If we had, we would have got a lot of cold stares, even from people who believed in the Union.
Right.
They just didn't believe in the communist arguments in the Union. To them, the Union was those demands we talked about before. And those were not racially based. They were just all about, give me a 40-hour week and give me a living wage. And, you know, you got to remember, people didn't have that. They were going hungry.
Right. So in these last minutes here, I want to spend a little bit of time bringing us up to the present. One thing, of course, with a very large number of teachers in our audience with us this evening, there are a lot of questions regarding unionization in North Carolina today. Bobby is wondering, when and how did the prohibition of unions, of state employee unions specifically, and strikes, how did that come to be implemented in North Carolina? Linda is asking, why can't teachers unionize in North Carolina? What is it going to take for us to unionize, and when we need to strike? So can you speak a little bit to that?
This is why it's good to have tenure. So, and
let me say, Carolina K-12 does not endorse or
well, Christy knows we do a lot of work. In a number of workshops, I do a whole hour on North Carolina labor history. And in fact, Gastonia is like one little piece of a much bigger puzzle. And in fact, I spend about the last 15 minutes being what they call in the union movement a sweatshop lawyer. I sort of teach a little labor law, just enough to be dangerous. But let me, so that we, again, I know this is a long story. I'm going to try to pack it into about 2 or 3 minutes. So first of all, I want to remind people you can join a union. If someone tells you you cannot join a union, they're telling you wrong. Under the First Amendment right of association, you can join a union. You do have the North Carolina Association of Educators. Now, some of you like it, some of you don't. I happen to think they actually do a lot of good work, and they are trying. They've had several organizing initiatives. So I would urge you to, I'm going to say, what the heck? I'd urge you to join. I actually belong to the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. So I'm proud to join a union. Now, you are correct, though, that in this state, the Union of Teachers, NCAA, does not have collective bargaining rights. So you can join a union, but the union cannot bargain with you for a contract. And that's a big deal. I completely agree. It makes the union weak, and that is quite deliberate. That is a law called North Carolina General Statute 9598. Not that I don't know it. I memorized it. And that was passed in 1959. Now, originally it tried to ban unions, but the courts threw that part out. People also went to court to challenge the ban on collective bargaining. They said, look, a union should have the right to collectively bargain. For some bizarre reason, the courts decided collective bargaining is not an inherent right of a union, which I find very bizarre, but that's the court's decision. So here in North Carolina, public employees can join unions, but the unions cannot bargain a contract. And remember, I am a public employee. I'm employed by North Carolina State University. I am, like you, a public employee of the state of North Carolina. I can join a union. I do. I'm proud of it, but it cannot bargain for me. I cannot get a collectively bargained contract. So what you need to do is not only perhaps join a union, perhaps, again, I'm just saying this, I'm not supposed to advocate, so I won't, but let me just put it this way. If you feel it's wrong, talk to your state legislator and find out where they stand. And if they're not in favor of repealing this law, maybe you ought to find someone else. Maybe you should run for the state legislature and lead that campaign. I mean, it really is it's a highly unusual law. I will tell you, in this entire United States, only 2 states have that kind of out and out ban. Now, in many states, they kind of have no law on collective bargaining for public employees. So it's very squishy. But only in North Carolina do they have this law that specifically says you cannot do it.
Only in North Carolina.
And I think Virginia used to have it, but Virginia now has a Democratic legislature and they may be removing that. So,
well, you just said something that is spot on. I mean, you've said many things that are spot on, but we need more teachers in legislative offices. We need more teachers because you guys are the ones who know what it's like to teach. You know, what's that saying? Those who can't teach make laws about teaching. So let's get some of you guys in office. So I have 2 final questions for you, David. And then we're gonna play out with another beautiful song from Katie Hayes. This one is maybe another big question though, so do your best. But, you know, in terms of bringing this up to today, how does this fight continue? Have we come far enough? You know, we were talking about, yes, we, you know, kind of have a 40-hour work week for some people, a 5-day a week for some people. You know, you joined us not too long ago for a wonderful program on the 1991 fire in Hamlet, North Carolina at Imperial Foods chicken processing plant. Maybe Paul can pop that program in the chat. It was a tragic story of just negligent deregulation, folks literally working themselves to death for starvation wages, like, you know, the LMA interview talked about. So is this still at play today? Have we come any distance? Have we come far enough? What would you have to say about?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I think we've certainly regressed in terms of the labor movement. In the middle of the 1950s, over a third of all American non-agricultural workers were in a union. Today, in the private sector, the union rate is about 6%. We haven't seen a rate that low since the 1920s. We're back 100 years ago. The only group that is more organized is actually public workers. And of course, that's not in the South. That's in places like New York and California and Illinois, where they're allowed to organize and bargain. Our labor movement is struggling. Now, things might change a bit with our new administration. Some of you may or may not know, and if not, you can check this out on President Biden's YouTube. I believe it's YouTube or Twitter. I'm bad on all this social media stuff. But the president on Sunday night released a video that some people are calling, in fact, several labor historians that I know have said it is the most pro-union remark by a president since Franklin Roosevelt. He basically said people have the right to join unions and they should not be intimidated or threatened, which unfortunately goes on all the time. The other thing the President Biden did his first day in office is he fired the general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, who happened to be a lawyer that worked for a union busting law firm for 20 years. So it was like putting the head fox in charge of the hen house. And he actually just said his first day, you're done, no more. And this was something that the AFL-CIO had asked him to do, but they weren't expecting him to do it. And he did it the first day. So President Biden is making a lot of gestures that he believes in workers' rights to organize. I as a labor historian, I will tell you a union is like any other human institution. It is not perfect. There are unions that have had a history of corruption. There are unions that have had a history of violence. There are unions that have had a history of racism. When I teach labor history, I bring all that up because I am not interested in I don't do a fluff job. I'm not a PR man. I'm a historian and a professor. So, but also unions have a record of fighting for people and for getting better wages and better benefits and better working conditions and dignity and respect on the job. So I think today, and again, if you look at, not only are our unionization rates back in the 1920s, our inequality rates have slipped back to where they were 100 years ago. And we may even be back where we were in the Gilded Age of the 1870s and 80s in terms of massive fortunes and massive poverty. And of course, the pandemic has only made it worse. So I just don't, not both as a historian and as a citizen, I've never understood this war on the labor movement that has taken place throughout my whole career. I mean, it's kind of like, is it something I said as a labor historian? It just coincides with the years. I mean, I've been teaching labor history for about 35 years, and that's sort of the height of this onslaught. And at the same time, inequality has grown, poverty has grown.
Mm.
I mean, life expectancy is declining among working class people. So, yeah, I mean, in other words, we unfortunately have not made progress. We've made some progress and then have slipped some. We're not back. I'm not saying we're back in the Gilded Age, but we're moving there. But right now, with a new administration coming out of this pandemic, I think there's opportunities, but it's up to us as citizens to seize those opportunities and to ask hard questions of our representatives. Where do you stand on these issues? And don't take a bunch of mealy-mouthed answers. Pin people, because again, I happen to be a registered independent, so I'm not shilling for any party.
We know you're a communist, David.
People on both sides of the aisle tend to give you a lot of yap, and we need to add, just like I do with my students, I ask tough questions if I meet a politician.
Right. Called critical thinking. And so the folks in the audience know we will share with you a great interview that David did with Frank Stasio and several other folks, including a descendant of LMA, that really situates the history in the present. And I know you guys talked a lot about COVID and nurses and things like that. And so I think that's a really interesting piece that I encourage folks to listen to if you want to tie this history to the present, which is always so powerful in the social studies and history classroom, to show that through line, that circle, even more than a line. So David, in closing, I want to get you out and on with your evening, but many folks have asked both tonight and in their pre-registration if there is a memorial to LMA. I know you talked about the marker for the Loray Mill strike finally being put up. I know there's a marker to the police chief who was shot. I do not believe there's a memorial for LMA as of yet, even though there is the May-Wiggins Memorial Committee working towards that. But, just thinking about that in terms of historical memory, I would love just for you to kind of give your final closing words of how do you think we should remember LMA? What should her legacy be? And maybe most importantly, what's most important to teach about her for those of us who have the power to stand at the front of a classroom?
Great thoughts all around. There is a grave marker now. At one point, LMA was in an unmarked grave. The grave is now marked. That was done, I want to say, in the late 1970s by in fact, now the National Organization of Women, I believe, raised the funds for a gravestone. There is talk about an LMA statue somewhere in Gastonia. It hasn't been done yet, and my guess is the local burghers might, dig in their heels about that, whether they want a statue. As far as teaching LMA, I think, there's a lot you can teach about the strike itself. There's a lot you can teach about the textile industry. I think in some ways she's a fascinating historical figure and a fascinating woman of the time to teach, because I kind of said this before and I'll say it again. She was in some ways typical and in some ways totally atypical.
Yeah.
And I would argue that's what makes her so interesting.
Yeah.
Parts of her life make her like thousands and thousands of other textile workers. Some folks may know the expression lint head, which was not meant as a compliment, but she was a lint head. She worked hard, didn't have a lot of education, came from the country, middle-class folk would have probably looked down on her. But at the same time, she was a woman that seemed to have a lot of native smarts, deep intelligence, deep emotional intelligence, love of her children, willing to literally fight for what she believed in, willing to think about black and white unite together, which again was way ahead of its time. Heck, it's even ahead of today's time in some ways.
Yeah.
So to me, if I were teaching LMA, that's what I would try. And in fact, when I do teach about her, I try to convey both of that to my students, that she's not superhuman. She's in some ways a woman of her time, and that's important to understand. And yet in some ways she's quite unique, and that's what also makes her remarkable, is that what makes her stand out. She's both sort of in the time and yet rises above the crowd. And that's how we want to think about her, I think.
Yeah. And Carolina K-12 has a great lesson plan on LMA that we will share with you in the follow-up resources. It includes excerpts of the oral history you heard tonight. It includes reading, primary sources. It's all around a really good packet for you to use with your students. With that, Dr. David Zonderman, as always, thank you so much. You are always right there at the ready when I call you up and say, can you join me for an event with teachers? And I want everyone to know who is with us that I know that that is because you respect and value and appreciate our K-12 teachers so much. So thank you for that. We appreciate you. I want to again say thank you so much to the North Caroliniana Society for sponsoring tonight's events. They are just the best partners we could ask for. Again, thank you to Dr. David Zonderman. A huge thank you to the amazingly talented Katie Hayes. And of course, thank you to all of you who've joined us tonight. Specific shout out to you amazing K-12 teachers in the house. You have faced an unimaginable year, and we appreciate you so much, more than you know, for everything you have done. And with that, we're going to leave the webinar open, like I said, for some final minutes with Katie Hayes singing us out with another of Ella May's ballads called All Around the Jailhouse. We'll also be here in the chat and the Q&A for a few more minutes. Good night, be well. We appreciate you guys.
All around the jailhouse, waiting for a trial. 1 mile from the Union Hall, sleeping in the jail. I walked up to the policeman, showing I had no fear. He said, if you've got money, I'll see that you don't stay here. Well, I haven't got a nickel, not a penny can I show. Lock her up in the cell, he said, and he slammed the jailhouse door. He let me out in July, the month I dearly love. Wide open spaces all around me, moon and the stars above. Well, everybody seems to want me, everybody but the scabs. I'm on my way from the jailhouse, I'm going back to the Union Hall. Though my tent now is empty, the heart is full of joy. I'm a mile